See, we have 1 minute before 12. I think it's perfect to start. If anybody's going to come in, they are welcome to. Thank you, everyone, for coming to our session today. Thank you, everyone, for coming to our monthly session of So Now You Know. Today, we'll be talking about what to consider before bringing your international nonprofit to South Africa. We'll be fleshing out a few topics within this, broader topic, which we hope will be informative for everyone. A little bit about myself. My name is Lauren. I head up data and regulations here at Legalese, and I'll be running through today's topic. Cool. So for today's webinar, we'll be touching on a few points that we think are important considerations. There are, however, many other factors beyond those that we'll be discussing today, and you're more than welcome to reach out to us should you need more advice on this topic. There are also numerous So Now You Know series, which you can also check out. So for today, the first thing we'll be touching on is just generally, are you thinking about setting up operations in South Africa? And, what are non-profit or international non-profit entities? Next, we'll be considering, or what I consider the most important consideration, the type of entity to register here in South Africa. After that, another big one is employment liabilities. This is something that comes up quite often, and we thought it quite important to touch on this topic today. Next is tax exemption, which is everyone's favorite. And lastly, registration as a non-profit organization. Cool. Jumping straight in, are you considering setting up in South Africa? I thought it best to start off by actually touching on what is international nonprofits and why it is lucrative or desired to set up operations in South Africa. So international nonprofit organizations or entities are those established with the primary objective of addressing global challenges and advancing the welfare of humanity. So these organizations operate across national boundaries and borders, and they focus on various issues such as poverty alleviation, human rights, environmental conservation, healthcare, education, and social justice. There are many international nonprofits that we're all very aware of. These are organizations such as the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, Change.org, and Doctors Without Borders, for example. Next, why establish operations in South Africa? Why come here? What makes us desirable? So there are many factors as to why an international nonprofit would want to set up operations in South Africa. Firstly, and most valuable, is that we have a rich and diverse culture that faces numerous and unique challenges due to our history and our circumstances. By establishing an entity in South Africa on the ground, an international nonprofit is able to directly engage with these issues, such as poverty and inequality, that affects many South Africans. Next, South Africa is a gateway into Africa as a whole, and it thereby offers opportunities for international nonprofits to branch out into the greater continent and collaborate with other organizations that are working on similar causes within the various other African countries. Next, within South Africa, we have a very well-developed legal structure that provides regulation along with support for the activities of nonprofit organizations. Our law is very well set up, and it's very clear and supportive for these organizations and their purposes. And lastly, and not to toot our own horn, but in South Africa, we have a very educated and skilled workforce, which is very attractive for nonprofit organizations. We have, great skilled workers and people who are able to be hired, but we also have very skilled researchers through our universities, as well as other nonprofit organizations which are set up in our country. So the first consideration is what type of entity to establish in the country. So in South Africa, there are essentially two options to set up operations within South Africa. Our Companies Act provides for two options for a foreign entity who seeks to conduct business in South Africa. The first option is the registration as an external company under our Companies Act, in which the nonprofit company will have a branch office in South Africa. With this option, an external company registered in South Africa is not considered a new entity. You don't create two separate entities. You instead, the one company is, well, it remains that one company and is simply registered in another country. So the operations in South Africa are that of a branch office and remain that of the external company in whatever country they originate from. So they are not two entities, simply one registered in two countries. The second option is that the non-profit company may incorporate a South African entity. This is normally a quote unquote wholly owned subsidiary of the foreign company. When doing this method, this creates a new and separate legal entity from the original one in the international country. This will mean that the new entity will have its own founding documents, its own structure, and be liable in its own name. In South Africa, non-profit companies do not have shareholders. They are non-profit entities, and therefore they cannot technically be wholly owned subsidiaries in the direct meaning of the term. So non-profit companies in South Africa can have what's known as members, and therefore the parent entity can be the sole member or invites other members of the non-profit company as opposed to shareholders specifically. The choice between a non-profit, the choice between a branch office or a South African company will really depend on various factors, such as tax considerations, liabilities faced, which we will touch on a bit in the next slide, and then what kind of presence the entity wants here in South Africa. These considerations are very important for an international nonprofit to take in. It's important to do their due diligence into what it would mean to set up operations here in South Africa and which of these two methods suits them and what they aim to do here. So next is employment liabilities. We thought it important to touch on employment liabilities as South Africa has very strict employment laws. This is an important consideration for international nonprofits because whether they set up a branch office here or whether you set up a new South African entity, you will need to comply with our employment laws. South African employment laws, such as the Labour Relations Act and the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, regulate the way employers manage their employees. This relates to disciplinary procedures, retrenchments, and things such as employee benefits. These are all regulated, and foreign entities cannot claim that because they are not based here, because they're a branch office, they don't need to abide by our employment laws. If you are employing South Africans in South Africa to perform work, you must abide by employment laws and ensure that employment is managed lawfully. Important considerations with the branch office versus the South African company is that in the case of a branch office, the external company will be liable for all the conduct carried out by the branch office through its employees and agents in South Africa. This then creates liability in South Africa for the foreign entity. In the case of South African entity, because it is separate and an independent entity, the parent company will not bear liability or not have or be liable for the conduct of South Africans within South Africa. Another important consideration, and many people don't view normally being a director as being an employee, but ultimately in South Africa, directors of a company have legal responsibilities known as fiduciary duties. Director fiduciary duties include to always act in the best interest of the company and to protect the company's interests at all times. Directors of a foreign company assume the legal responsibilities of directors under South African law, and this poses an area for liability because our director laws may be more onerous than their own in the country in which they are based. This is also especially important because when a director breaches their fiduciary duties in South Africa, this is a litigible action and directors may face liability in this regard due to their actions. This is why it's an important consideration when bringing your entity to South Africa and keeping in mind these sorts of liabilities. Next is tax exemption. In South Africa, non-profit organizations are not afforded tax exemption as a default. It's not something that is automatically received simply because you are performing a philanthropic or non-profit act. In South Africa, tax exemption is something that must be applied for directly to the South African Revenue Services. They administer tax exemption as they are our revenue provider. Tax exemption is also only awarded to entities who undertake one or more public benefit activity, which is listed in the Income Tax Act. In terms of the Income Tax Act, tax exemption is twofold. The first stage is an entity may apply to be considered a public benefit organization, or PBO, as many people simply call it. In this regard, the entity must perform a public benefit activity listed in Part 1 of the 9th schedule to the Income Tax Act. This then affords the organization tax exemption for its own acts. The second fold is what's known as Section 18A approval, because it stems from Section 18A of the Income Tax Act. In this regard, successful applicants can issue receipts that allow their donations made to them to be tax deductible by the donor. In this regard, the entity must perform public benefit activities listed in Part 2 of the 9th schedule to the Income Tax Act. Hence the description that it is twofold. Neither fold of tax exemption, as I said, is automatic, and the threshold for Section 18A approval is a little bit stricter than Section 30, as Part 1 has a broader list of public benefit activities than Part 2. Again, if this is something that you want to know more about, you're more than welcome to come to us and ask us about PBO status and how to apply. The last aspect that I want to touch on is NPO status, or nonprofit organization status. In South Africa, we have the Non-Profit Organizations Act. The aim of the NPO Act is to regulate and promote the registration of charitable entities as non-profit organizations. Registration as a non-profit organization must not be confused with the type of entity that an organization is. This is why we thought it important to touch on this aspect in today's webinar, because we find that this is always a point of confusion. Any philanthropic entity can register as an NPO. That means that whether the entity is a nonprofit company, as we discussed earlier, registered under the Companies Act, whether it is a trust administered by the Master's Office, or whether it is a voluntary association, which is a collection of people that is founded by a constitution, they can all register as an NPO. As long as you undertake a charitable or philanthropic purpose or activity, you may register as an NPO. NPO registration is handled by the Department of Social Development. And when you register as an NPO or apply to be registered as an NPO, the department will add you to its list or growing list of NPO. And the reason that many entities do this and undertake this registration is because once you are on the list, or once you are registered as an NPO, you will be provided with an NPO number, and you'll be eligible for consideration, or should you apply, for government grants and funding. This is very important if the public benefit activities you wish to undertake hedge on receiving governmental grants and funding and incorporation into governmental programs. So that's something that we want to do. Just note that whether you're an NPC, a nonprofit company, whether you're a trust, whether you're a voluntary association, you can be an NPO. These registrations and titles are not exclusive. That doesn't knock out the other. So, for example, as we said earlier about tax exemption, you can be registered as a public benefit organization. And with that registration, you can also register as a non-profit organization, and also then be the original entity, which is an NPC, trust, or voluntary association. So all of these, there might be lots of acronyms, but it doesn't mean they're exclusive, and that's why we wanted to touch on this point now. So thank you, everyone. We have come to the conclusion. As I said earlier, there are many other considerations when setting up operations in South Africa. Importantly, is just general compliance, for example. This is in terms of company laws, where you set up a nonprofit company. Also, data protection laws, especially with regards to the processing and storing and sharing of personal information, as well as tax considerations. Public benefit or tax exemption status is not the only tax consideration. It's important to do a due diligence on these aspects. The reason why we've also not touched, for example, on general compliance and structuring aspects in this webinar is it's something that we've touched on in our previous series. All our So Now You Knows are available on our YouTube channel, and you can definitely go have a look at to see, these other aspects that we've touched on in previous months with regards to, nonprofit considerations and also other company considerations as well. So yeah, if there's any other questions, anyone's more than welcome to raise. That'll be the end of our webinar. As I said, if any of these other aspects have raised any questions for you or you'd like to know more information, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. You can call us directly, reach out via our website or on our social media channels as well. So yeah, if there's no other questions, thank you everybody. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.